My brother called. Mom died last night. I inherited everything. You get nothing. Then I smiled. The call came at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, one of those biting, gray Toronto mornings where the snow drifts aimlessly past the window. My phone buzzed on the counter, displaying a name I hadn't seen in weeks. My brother, Glenn. "Douglas, I have some difficult news," he began. His voice carried a practiced, hollow solemnity that immediately set me on edge. Mom passed away last night, peacefully, in her sleep. Before the weight of those words could even settle in my chest, his tone shifted. The mask of the grieving son slipped, replaced by the cold, surgical efficiency of a liquidator. "The funeral is Friday. I've already handled the arrangements," he continued. "And Douglas? About the estate. The will is ironclad. The house, the Muskoka cottage, the investments, everything goes to me. You get nothing. Don't even think about contesting it." Then he hung up. I stood in my kitchen as the silence of the house began to ring in my ears. No, I'm sorry for our loss. No shared memories. Just a cold-blooded warning to stay away from the money. But as a retired civil engineer, I spent 40 years identifying structural rot. Glenn's story had a massive crack in it. My mother, Helen, had been a sharp-witted schoolteacher her entire life, until 9 months ago. That was the exact moment Glenn convinced her to sign over power of attorney. Suddenly, she was diagnosed with rapid-onset dementia and moved into a nursing home, where she sat vacant and heavily sedated. Driven by a gut feeling, I called the Maple Grove Care Center. My heart hammered against my ribs as the nurse answered. I told her I'd heard my mother had passed. There was a pause that felt like an eternity before she replied, "Sir, your mother is fine. She's having breakfast right now. Is there some confusion?" The blood in my veins turned to ice. My brother wasn't just greedy. He was staging a death to finalize a heist. Part 2. The paper trail. I didn't waste a second. I hired Sarah Mitchell, a private investigator who specialized in financial fraud. Within 24 hours, she laid out the grim reality on my kitchen table. In just 8 months, Glenn had bled $280,000 from Mom's accounts and sold her beloved Muskoka cottage to a shell company. But the smoking gun was the doctor. Dr. James Whitmore, the man who signed the dementia diagnosis, wasn't just a random specialist. He was Glenn's old college roommate. They hadn't just stolen her money. They had stolen her mind, using heavy sedation to mimic a total cognitive collapse. That evening, I drove to the care center through a thickening blizzard. I slipped into Mom's room and found her by the window. For the first time in months, her eyes seemed to track my movement. The sedation was finally wearing off. I leaned in close, whispering, "Mom, it's Douglas. I'm here." Her hand twitched, her fingers weakly gripping mine with a spark of recognition that broke my heart and fueled my rage. Glenn was planning a funeral for a woman who was still breathing, thinking he could bury his crimes along with her. He thought he was playing a high-stakes game of real estate. He forgot that I build things to last, and I know exactly how to tear a crooked structure down. Part 3. The Midnight Secret. Things escalated quickly. I arrived at the nursing home the next afternoon to find Mom's room empty. A nurse told me Glenn had taken her for a drive. When they returned 3 hours later, Mom looked like a ghost, her body limp as Glenn dragged her back to her bed. He looked me in the eye and laughed off the fake death news from the morning, calling it a simple misunderstanding. He stood there, smug and untouchable, hiding behind his legal power of attorney. But that night, the world flipped on its axis. At 10 p.m., my phone buzzed with a block number. A voice, thin but unmistakable, whispered through the receiver, "Douglas, come to my room. Make sure Glenn isn't here." I snuck back into the facility like a shadow. When I entered her room, I didn't find a vacant patient. My mother was sitting upright, her eyes piercing and lucid. "Close the door," she said, her voice steady and strong. The truth was more shocking than any lie Glenn had told. Mom had been faking the extent of her dementia for months. She had realized Glenn was spiraling and needed to know which of her sons loved the woman and which loved the bank account. She had secretly moved her main assets into an irrevocable trust before Glenn ever got control, leaving just enough in the reachable accounts to serve as bait. You passed the test, Douglas, she whispered. You came when I had nothing left to give you. But Glenn failed. Part 4. The final act. The next 48 hours were a masterpiece of strategic warfare. We coordinated with the police and my lawyer, installing button-sized cameras in her room. We watched in horror as Glenn visited her on Thursday night, bringing a syringe filled with a massive dose of sedatives. Tomorrow, you'll finally be at peace, he hissed, smoothing her hair with the same hand that was trying to end her life. Mom palmed the medication and feigned sleep, letting the trap set itself. Friday, 2 p.m. The Thornhill Funeral Home was draped in black. Glenn stood at the podium, a portrait of manufactured grief, delivering a eulogy for a mother he thought was currently at the crematorium. She wanted me to have everything, he told the weeping crowd, because she knew I was the only one she could count on. That's interesting, Glenn, I said, standing up from the back row. My voice cut through the room like a blade. Want to tell everyone where Mom's body is? Because the crematorium says they never received her. The room erupted in confusion. Glenn's face went from pale to ghostly white. But the real blow came from the back of the hall. The heavy oak doors swung open, and Helen Margaret Harrison walked in. She was on a walker, but she carried herself like a queen. The gasps were deafening. "Hello, son," Mom said, her voice echoing off the chapel walls. "I'm not dead, but your inheritance is." Part 5. The Aftermath. The police moved in before Glenn could even reach the exit. Handcuffed in front of his wife, his children, and the entire community, the successful real estate agent was exposed for exactly what he was. He was charged with elder abuse, grand larceny, and attempted fraud. A year later, the dust has settled. Glenn is serving a 5-year sentence, his career and family gone. Dr. Whitmore lost his license and his freedom. But Mom? She's more alive than ever. We sit on the porch now, watching the Toronto snow, just like we did the morning this all began. She told me she regretted that the test was necessary, but she never regretted seeking the truth. Glenn chose a bank account. I chose my mother. In the end, we both got exactly what we deserved. Blood makes you related, but loyalty makes you family. And in the Harrison house, the bridges I build are finally standing on a foundation of truth. I didn't wait for the snow to clear. That afternoon, I sat across from Sarah Mitchell, a private investigator with a reputation for seeing through ironclad facades. She was a sharp woman in her mid-40s, with streaks of gray in her dark hair that suggested she'd seen it all. "How long has your brother held the power of attorney?" she asked, her pen hovering over a notebook. 9 months, I replied. It happened right after Mom supposedly developed dementia. Before that, she was perfectly competent, volunteering at the library and playing bridge twice a week. Then, overnight, she couldn't remember her own name. Sarah nodded slowly. "I've seen cases like this before. Give me 48 hours. I'll find out exactly where your mother's money is going." That evening, I drove back to Maple Grove without warning. I found Mom sitting in her usual chair by the window, staring out at the darkening sky. She looked frail, her hair thinning and her face more lined than I remembered. But tonight, something was different. She seemed less sedated, more present. "Mom," I whispered, pulling up a chair. She turned slowly, her familiar brown eyes meeting mine. For a fleeting second, I saw it, recognition. Or was I just desperate to see it? "It's me, Douglas. Your son." Her mouth worked as if she were trying to summon a word from a deep fog. But before she could speak, a nurse bustled in to check her vitals, and the moment vanished. I drove home through the blizzard, my mind racing. Glenn was planning a funeral for a living woman. Was he going to transfer every last asset while the world thought she was gone? It was insane, but in its own dark way, it was brilliant. The next morning, the phone rang. It was Sarah. "Douglas, you need to sit down." I sat at my kitchen table, bracing myself. "Your brother has been very busy," she said. "In the last 8 months, he's transferred approximately $280,000 from your mother's accounts into his own. He sold her Muskoka cottage to a numbered company, and he's been maxing out her credit cards. But Douglas, here's the kicker. The doctor who diagnosed her, Dr. James Whitmore, he went to university with Glenn. They've been close friends for 30 years. A wave of nausea hit me. It wasn't just greed, it was medical gaslighting. If she was being overprescribed sedatives to mimic dementia, this wasn't just theft, it was attempted murder. We need proof, Sarah warned. Document everything. Record your brother if you can. Ontario is a one-party consent province. In the meantime, get back to that nursing home. I rushed to Maple Grove that afternoon, phone ready to record. But when I reached Mom's room, it was empty. A nurse I didn't recognize was stripping the bed. Panic flared in my chest. Where's my mother? Oh, Mr. Harrison? Your brother took her out for a drive about an hour ago. Said she needed some fresh air. My blood ran cold. I ran to the parking lot, but Glenn's black Mercedes was long gone. I called him 5 times. No answer. For 3 agonizing hours, I waited. Finally, the car pulled in. Glenn helped Mom out, supporting her as she shuffled toward the entrance. She looked utterly exhausted, her eyes rolling in confusion. Glenn spotted me in the hallway and didn't even bother to hide his irritation. Douglas, what are you doing here? You told me Mom died yesterday, I snapped. And yet, here she is. He had the audacity to laugh. Oh, that? Yeah, sorry about the confusion. I meant to call you back. False alarm. Mom had a bad episode, and I thought, well, you know how dementia is. It's unpredictable. Where did you take her, Glenn? She looks like she can barely stand. His voice dropped, turning cold and hard. Back off, Douglas. I'm her power of attorney. I make the decisions about her care, not you. You want to challenge that? Get a lawyer. He brushed past me, guiding Mom into her room. I watched through the doorway as he settled her into a chair, whispering something in her ear that I couldn't catch. He walked away without a second glance, leaving me standing in the cold shadow of his arrogance that I was halfway to my car when my phone buzzed. It was an unknown, blocked number. I almost ignored it, but something, call it intuition, made me press answer. At first, there was only silence. Then a whisper. A woman's voice, faint and scratchy, breathed my name. Douglas. Yes? Who is this? Douglas, it's me. The voice was so quiet, I had to press the phone against my ear until it hurt. Who? I asked, my heart beginning to race. It's your mother. I froze in the middle of the parking lot. It was impossible. My mother was 10 yards away in that building, unable to string 2 coherent words together. Douglas, listen carefully. The voice continued, sharper now. I don't have much time. I need you to come to my room tonight. Late? After 10 p.m., make sure Glenn isn't here. And Douglas, do not tell a soul about this call. The line went dead. I stood there, snow melting against my skin, staring at my phone as if it had turned into an alien object. It couldn't be her. And yet, that whispered tone had the unmistakable authority of the woman who raised me, the real Helen Harrison. I waited in my car until long after dark. Once Glenn's black Mercedes finally cleared the lot and the night shift took over, I used my key code to slip through the side entrance. When I reached Mom's room, the lights were low. She was sitting up in bed, waiting. As I entered, she turned to look at me. In the dim light, her eyes weren't vacant. They were clear, focused, and completely lucid. Close the door, she said. Her voice wasn't a mumble. It was strong and resonant. My hand shook as I clicked the door shut. Mom? What is happening? Sit down, sweetheart, she said with a small, wry smile, the exact look she used to give me when she caught Glenn and me sneaking cookies before dinner. We need to talk, and we don't have much time. I sat completely stunned. Are you okay? I don't understand. I'm fine, Douglas. I've been fine this whole time, she said, reaching out to take my hand. Her grip was firm and steady. The dementia, the diagnosis, it was an act. I was pretending. The room seemed to tilt. Pretending? But why? I'm 85 years old, Douglas. I've been thinking about what happens when I'm gone. I needed to know something. I needed to know which of my sons would actually take care of me. Not for an inheritance, but out of love. When Glenn suggested the power of attorney, I saw an opportunity. I agreed, but I also consulted my own lawyer behind his back. I moved my assets into an irrevocable trust weeks before Glenn got his hands on the POA. I only left enough in those accounts to see what he would do with it. Tears began to blur my vision. Mom, why didn't you tell me? Her eyes softened with a hint of sadness. Because I had to test you both. I had to see who would sit with me when I had nothing left to give. And you came, Douglas. 3 times a week, you held my hand and talked to me, even when you thought I didn't know your name. Of course I came. I choked out. You're my mother. I know that now. But Glenn. She shook her head. Glenn failed, Douglas. Worse than I ever imagined. I've been documenting everything. Every time he pressured me to sign papers. Every time he stole from this room. I've let him dig his own grave. Mom, he told me you were dead. He's planning a funeral for Friday. She nodded solemnly. I know. He told me during our drive today. He said I was going to have an accident and pass away peacefully. He's running out of time, and he's getting desperate. This is dangerous, I said, standing up. We're calling the police right now. Not yet, she insisted. Your lawyer, Robert Chin? He's been working with me for a month. We have a plan, Douglas. I need you to trust me. The next 48 hours were a blur of adrenaline and secrecy. Robert brought in the police quietly, and they agreed to let the plan play out to catch Glenn in the act. We installed button-sized cameras in Mom's room and coordinated with a few trusted staff members. Glenn came by twice more. The first time, he tried to force her to sign house transfer documents. Mom just scribbled something illegible and played the part of the confused patient. The second time, Thursday night, was darker. He brought a syringe, claiming it was her medication. We had it tested later. It was a massive dose of sedatives, enough to put down a horse. Mom palmed the pills he gave her and feigned sleep. Tomorrow, Glenn had whispered, smoothing her hair with a chilling tenderness. Tomorrow, you'll finally be at peace, Mom. No more suffering. Friday morning arrived with a hollow, eerie feeling. Glenn had gone all out at the Thornhill funeral home. He'd sent out notices and filled the room with expensive flowers. I sat in the front row with my daughter, Emma, who had flown in that morning, sick with the secret we were carrying. Glenn sat across the aisle, his face a mask of composed sorrow. At exactly 2 p.m., he stood up to deliver the eulogy. He spoke of protecting Mom's interests and managing her affairs. Mom always loved me best, he told the room, his voice cracking with a performance that turned my stomach. She trusted me to use her legacy wisely, to take care of the family the way only I could. That was my cue. I stood up, feeling every eye in the room turned toward me. That's an interesting story, Glenn, I said, my voice echoing off the chapel. Want to tell everyone where Mom really is right now, Glenn? Confusion rippled through the room like a physical wave. Glenn's face went from a performative flush to a deathly white. Douglas, sit down. He hissed into the microphone. This isn't the time. Where's the body, Glenn? I stepped into the aisle, my voice projecting to the back of the hall. Where is she? She's being cremated. We discussed this. Really? Because I called the crematorium 10 minutes ago. They have no record of her. Beside him, his wife Patricia grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with sudden doubt. Glenn, what is he talking about? At that exact moment, the heavy oak doors at the back of the chapel swung open. Every head in the room turned. There, framed in the doorway against the winter light, stood my mother. She moved slowly with her walker, but her back was straight and her gaze was like steel. Behind her, 2 uniformed police officers followed in silence. The room erupted. People gasped. Someone in the back row screamed. Glenn's daughter burst into tears as my mother began her long, steady walk down the aisle. When she reached the podium, she stopped and looked up at her younger son. Hello, Glenn, she said, her voice clear and resonant. I'm not dead, but your inheritance is. Glenn's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Mom, you're confused. You're sick. This is all a big mistake. I'm not confused, Glenn. I've been recording everything for the past 8 months. Every threat, every theft, every time you try to drug me into compliance or force me to sign away my life. She turned to the crowd, her expression softening with regret. I'm so sorry for deceiving you all, but I had to know the truth. I had to see what my own flesh and blood would do if he thought I was helpless. And what I found broke my heart. One of the officers stepped forward, the metallic click of handcuffs echoing in the sudden silence. Glenn Harrison, you're under arrest for elder abuse, grand larceny, and attempted probate fraud. In a final act of desperation, Glenn tried to bolt. He pushed past the officer, lunging for the side exit, but he didn't make it 3 steps before he was tackled to the floor. As they led him away in front of his sobbing children and a horrified wife, he screamed back at us, "I'm your son. You can't do this. I needed that money." Mom watched him go, tears finally tracking down her face. "You were my son," she whispered, though he was too far away to hear. "But you stopped being my child the moment you decided my life was worth less than my bank account." The aftermath, the legal battle that followed, was grueling, but the evidence was irrefutable. Between the hidden camera footage, the audio recordings, and Dr. Whitmore's eventual confession, after he was offered a plea deal, there was no escape for Glenn. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 5 years in prison, ordered to repay the $280,000 he'd stolen plus heavy fines. Dr. Whitmore lost his medical license permanently. The College of Physicians and Surgeons had no mercy for a doctor who used his prescription pad as a weapon. Patricia filed for divorce shortly after the sentencing, and while the kids were devastated, Emma and I did our best to be the stable family they needed. Mom moved into a bright, quiet condo near my house. She was done with the big estates and the drama. She spent her final years volunteering at an elder abuse prevention center, using her story to teach other seniors how to spot the warning signs of financial predators. Together, we established the Helen Harrison Protection Fund to provide legal aid to victims of elder fraud. One evening, about a year after the funeral that never was, Mom and I sat on my back porch watching the Toronto snow pile up on the fence. "Do you ever regret it?" I asked softly. The test. She was quiet for a long time, clutching her tea. "I regret that it was necessary. I regret that my own son was capable of such things. But Douglas, I don't regret finding the truth. I had to know who would love me when I had nothing left to give. You gave me everything that mattered. You taught me integrity, Mom," I replied, squeezing her hand. "You taught me that doing the right thing matters most when it's the hardest to do." She smiled, her eyes as sharp and clear as ever. "And that's why you passed. Not just because you visited, but because even when you thought I was gone, even when you thought you were getting nothing, you fought for me. That's what real family does. Blood makes you related, Douglas, but love is a choice. Glenn was my blood, but he stopped being family the second he started treating me like an asset to be liquidated." We sat in a comfortable silence then. Inside, the phone was buzzing, Emma calling for Vancouver. Life was moving forward. "You know what the saddest part is?" Mom asked. "What's that?" If Glenn had just asked, if he had just been honest about his struggles, I would have helped him. Not by enabling his greed, but I would have been there for him. Instead, he chose to treat me like I was already in the ground. And that choice cost him everything. I didn't have an answer for that. I just held her hand. My mother, my hero, the woman who taught me that dignity is worth more than any inheritance, and that real love shows up even when there is absolutely nothing to gain. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.